Hi, my name's Kerri. I am an academic. I work at Edge Hill University and I work on women's writing primarily. And that's where I got interested in writing about women's walking, which coincides with my personal interest in hill walking and climbing mountains, which started about 10 years ago when I walked up Snowdon for the first time, which was a very interesting experience, a very tough experience. But moving to Scotland 10 years ago gave me the opportunity to do a lot more walking. And I'm very lucky to live in the Scottish borders, which is where I'm currently sat in my dining room, looking out over the hills and fields of the farm where I live. It's very green, but it's also very grey. We've got a heart today, so there's not much to see beyond the horizon.
Oh, that sounds just so idyllic and beautiful. So you mentioned that you got into walking 10 years ago. What happened at that point? What changed for you?
I'd been interested in walking for a long time, but I don't come from a family that's got any interest in or background in walking at all. And I remember when I was about 15, wanting to walk the Offa's Dyke path. And I remember getting the book out and talking to my parents about it. But I had no idea how to go about doing a trip like that, and nor did they. And the idea sort of died, and off I went to university. And whilst I was at university, I started to put on a huge amount of weight, and I got heavier and heavier as I did my PhD. And it was finishing my PhD that I decided that if I'd got the discipline to do a PhD, then I had the discipline to get down to a healthy weight. And I decided to do that by getting fit enough to do the Yorkshire Three Peaks Challenge. So I started playing squash, which I'd never done before, and I started to get out and about in Yorkshire with friends with whom I'd done my PhD. So started climbing some of the hills there. So lots of walks up near Grassington, up into the Dales, which was wonderful. And then started to do some of the hills, Pennygent and Whernside. Ingleborough remains my favourite of the three. And after about 6 months, which included my first trip up a mountain, up Snowdon, I got fit enough to be able to do this. But I didn't do it for a couple of years. And then I did manage it, and I did it in the required 12 hours to join the Completers Club. And from that point onwards, started to get more interested in climbing hills and bigger hills. So I went to the Lake District for the first time and remember being blown away by what I saw, and climbed Catbells and then Great End, Great Gable, Scarfell Pike. Really enjoyed being in the Lake District, and then moved to Scotland. And again, my mind was blown by a different scale again. And I was really lucky that not long after I moved to Scotland that I found a couple of groups on Meetup, the Glasgow Hill Walkers Club and the really quite amusingly named Scottish Hill Walkers and Activities Group. I won't outline the acronym for you, but they were filled with really wonderful, kind people who took us up on walks. The walk guides and leaders were really considerate, and they gave me the confidence to get up into the hills. So I remember walking up Bidi and Namban on one of these walks, my first A walk, and just having the most amazing experience on the biggest hill in Argyll. And from that point I was hooked and started to collect the Munros. But I've also done loads and loads of low-level walking, medium-level walking. Everywhere I've gone in Scotland, I've tried to walk, and it's one of the deepest passions of my life.
Oh, I love that so much. And you're also sharing that passion as well, because are you a leader of Women in the Hills, another group?
Yes, well, I'm what's called a co-investigator. I'm the co-lead of a project that started, unfortunately, very shortly before the pandemic hit. So we've not got very far with what we'd hoped to achieve. But it's a group funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the purpose of the group is to bring together people from across the outdoor industries. So walkers, runners, climbers, climbing bodies, landowners, landowning charities, land managers, all sorts of different people who have a stake in the uplands of Scotland in particular, but Britain more widely, to talk to them about what steps we can take to increase and to improve women's access to upland landscapes, because a lot of the research demonstrates that women are less likely to go into the outdoors. And if they do, they're going to experience things that men won't, such as difficulties obtaining kit of the right size, of being able to access childcare, of being confident enough to go out and do it. So we're interested as a research network is what we are. We're interested in facilitating conversations between these very different people with very different stakes, very different experiences, to see if we can come together to find a holistic solution that enables women to more confidently and more frequently get outdoors in the ways in which they like.
Oh, I love that so much. I think it's so needed as well. So I love what you're doing in that space. Now, one of the interesting things that you've been working on, I'm not sure how long you've been working on it for, but you've got a new book coming out called Wanderers, A History of Women Walking, which is going to be coming out in September 2020, which is obviously very, very exciting. I'd love to hear more about this book, where the idea came from, how it evolved.
It's been a long time in the making. I started writing this in 2012, which was the year that Robert Macfarlane's The Old Ways was published. And it was reading Robert Macfarlane and getting a bit annoyed at Robert, to be honest, for having so few women in his account, that I just didn't believe that could be the case, that there could be so few women. He writes really movingly about Nan Shepard, and I've come to really value the work that he's done in promoting Shepard's writing to a wider public. But it didn't seem sensible to me that was the only writer who'd ever spoken about this topic. So I did what I've been trained to do as an academic, which was disappear off into the archives and start rummaging about to see what I could find. And over the course of several years, I managed to find a whole plethora of stories of women who went off into the outdoors in different ways and for different reasons. And through the course of writing the book, realised I'd start to wander about and then start to find a tradition of women's walking that means something very profoundly different for women writers than this very traditional or inspiration in the mountains. That for women writers, there's a particular strength to be found in drawing on the women that went before. And I've managed to uncover so many of these amazing people that were there way before we think they should have been, and way before most writers seem to think they could have been.
Yeah. You've done a book and it's about sort of 10 women and it's focused on sort of the past 300 years. Could you share maybe a few of the tidbits or a few of the women and a few of the stories that really stood out for you personally?
So I think a woman's story for me that really resonates is that of Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, who's known primarily now as the wife of the essayist William Hazlitt, who was a really important romantic figure in the 1800s, a friend of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and a very accomplished walker himself. And there's lots and lots and lots written about William and his works, but very little about Sarah. But I found a journal of hers that had been republished by an academic in the 1960s, but was otherwise very little known. And it's the account of her time in Edinburgh in 1822. And she happens to be in Edinburgh because her husband, William, has fallen in love with his landlady's daughter and wants to marry her. She's 16. So he's looking to obtain a quickie, cheapy divorce from Scotland, which is very much easier to obtain than one from England, where you have to have an Act of Parliament. So his wife is brought up to Edinburgh by boat and lodged in Scotland so that they can work together for William to be found in criminal conversation with a prostitute in the capital city. And Sarah's diary records her enormous emotional distress at this whole process, because she has to perjure herself. She has to swear an oath of calumny to say that she had no knowledge of what her husband was up to. But of course, she's been involved in the planning. And there's also the extraordinary threat of being left a single unmarried woman in the 1820s, which is an unenviable position. She's also got a young son. So there's a lot of different things at stake here. She's going to end up in a very vulnerable position for various reasons, as well as this very sordid affair that she's found herself mixed up in. So what she does is, in between the very unpleasant bits of business to do with the divorce, is she wanders off around Edinburgh. She covers miles and miles and miles. She walks over to Lasswade. She climbs Arthur's Seat. She walks to Leith. She walks all along the Forth. She covers huge distances. But what made me sit up and take notice was when she just suddenly, with no notice in the diary whatsoever, hops on a boat up the Forth and disappears on a solo walking trip around the Southern Highlands. And it's just the most extraordinary description. She sets off on one of what is increasingly a standard tourist route. So she goes off and sees some of the falls that you're supposed to go off and see near Callander. And she's having this very standard time. You'll find similar accounts in other people's writing, including William Wordsworth's. But then she heads up over to Loch Katrine, and one of the most striking things of the diary is her account of crossing over from Loch Katrine to Loch Lomond, so on the flanks of Ben Lomond itself. And she gets lost in the mist. And bearing in mind, this is 1822. She's wearing skirts, heavy skirts. She's not got particularly good shoes. She probably doesn't have a map. She certainly doesn't have a compass. And from what she tells us elsewhere in her diary, she doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of supplies with her either. She tends to go out with a sandwich and an apple. And there she is, lost on the fell side in the mist. But she doesn't despair. She keeps going. She finds the resources within herself to find her way. And eventually she drops down onto Loch Lomond, where she finds the ferry. She travels across the loch and ends up at the accommodation that she'd arranged. And she exults in what she has achieved. She is thrilled by the danger that she survived. She's exhilarated by how hard she's had to work her body. And her diary talks so ravishingly about the power that she is aware of having in herself. It's totally compelling. And from there, she gets the boat down to Dumbarton. From Dumbarton, she walks down to the Falls of Clyde. And from the Falls of Clyde, she walks all the way back to Edinburgh in one day. And in her diary, she meticulously records each day's distance. And it adds up. I think the first tour is something like 130 miles in 7 days. And I have no idea how she did that. That's just extraordinary. So then she goes straight back into the law business in Edinburgh. She starts to become very physically ill because of the strains of it all, and then heads off on a second walking tour a couple of weeks later. Not quite the same sort of route. This time she heads up to Perth and spends a lot of time up near Doon and up around those sorts of places, heads over to Crieff, and ends up in conversation with various people that she encounters. And she, again, has these really wonderful experiences. She sees all sorts of things. She covers great distances. She walks nearly 130 miles again on this trip. And the difference between Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt when she's walking and the frightened, anxious, unwell person in Edinburgh who's struggling to cope with all of these different pressures is extraordinary. So for me, that is one of the clearest and most inspirational stories, the power of walking, of being able to take control of your own body, decide how much suffering you want to endure, and relishing in the power of what you're capable of doing. That for me is one of the most inspirational stories that I came across.
What's been the biggest challenge for you when you've been out walking?
That's changed as I've 2 years ago I had my first child. So the biggest challenge for me at the moment is childcare. And just being able to get up and do the sorts of hills that I want to do. Unless we've got grandparents helping out, it's difficult now for me to get out into the mountains. Before that, fitness was my biggest challenge. I've had to manage my weight quite carefully and not always succeeded at that. But trying to maintain a good level of fitness has been one of the major challenges, and it's specifically hill fitness, which has always struck me as unfairly being quite different from other kinds of fitness. So it hasn't mattered how good I am on a squash court. I still sometimes find myself huffing and puffing up a hill. So for me, that's the biggest issue. And I guess now that it's more likely that I'm going to have to go out on my own if I'm going to go out at all. I usually walk with friends or my husband. My map reading isn't the best, and my confidence in landscapes where there are no clear paths isn't the greatest. So that will be the challenge in the immediate future, I think, is I'm very good at reading topography, but actually, taking bearings and doing the actual, science of map reading, not so good.
Now, something else in your book, you actually picked sort of a more modern walker, Cheryl Strayed. And I'd love for you to share more about your understandings from Cheryl and her book, from her book Wild, and what you've learned from that.
I think one of the things that struck me most about Cheryl Strayed's book was its frankness in talking about what it means to walk with a female body and the consequences of that. She actually talks about menstruation and how her changing body reacts differently as she becomes leaner and more home to the trail. I don't know that in fact, I'm not sure I know of any others that talk with that level of frankness about the female body and the consequences for your physical capabilities. So I think that level of openness about what it means to be female on the trail. And she's also the only writer, I think, that I explore who touches on a real moment of threat in the outdoors, a threat brought on by men, the fear of rape, which I think has become a trope that women in the outdoors are aware of, but actually from the works that I've looked at is vanishingly rare as an actual thing that occurs. But it occurs for Strayed, and talking about how she handles that as a woman is really interesting as well. So she doesn't shy away from her femininity and what that brings, what differences that brings that are both positive and perhaps negative in terms of her capabilities as a walker. And I thought that was a really important perspective to bring to the table, to have in the book, to have that acknowledgement that female bodies behave differently, female bodies react differently in the environment to different things, not necessarily just physical threat. Because in other stories that I've looked at, female bodies grant access to different spaces to male bodies. For instance, Dorothy Wordsworth in the 1800s is invited into a house that's grieving. It's a house populated by women, and one of the children of the house has died and is actually laid out on the table when Dorothy comes past for the traditional hospitality that was offered on the road at this time. And men would have had that hospitality offered to them outside, but because Dorothy is female and as is her sister-in-law, they're actually able to go into the house and become part of this community of grieving females. So I think what Strayed does so interestingly is demonstrate the ways in which the female body opens up new possibilities. And for me, that was really refreshing. I think we've all got used to hearing about female bodies as being vulnerable, as female bodies being weaker or lesser. And what her story demonstrated was actually they are different. Certainly they're different, but that opens up new possibilities, new ways of seeing, different ways of being. And I found that enormously important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lots of other women, really connected with her words and what she said. And I think that's one of the reasons there are so many more women now going out to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, because they've seen and heard about Cheryl and what she did. And I think it's so important that female role models are out there in the media. And, it is such a shame when you look back historically and you don't actually hear about these women. Their stories have been forgotten. How easy was it to find the information, digging through the archives? Where were you looking? How were you finding this information out?
The information is out there. I didn't, magically discover a box that some librarian had forgotten to catalogue, 300 years ago. It's not like that at all. It's just people don't look for it. The walking books I was reading around Macfarlane's were so dismissive of the fact that they might even exist, that women writers might even exist. They didn't actually just bother. Apart from Dorothy Wordsworth and Virginia Woolf, says one, there were no women walkers. So out of a book of, I think it was 200 odd pages, 3 or 4 were devoted to women. And I've seen other studies that just decided that, walking just didn't mean the same for women as it did for men. Therefore, it doesn't mean anything. So it's not a matter of these stories not being there. It's just a matter of us not knowing that they're there and therefore simply not bothering to look for them. So for me, the way to find them was just going off and Googling things and reading stuff about walking was a real help. I also got lucky. I've got some friends who work on related topics, and one of them suggested to me, well, you might want to have a look at Harriet Martineau. I was like, oh, okay. I knew a bit about Harriet Martineau, but not very much. I knew that she'd lived in the Lake District and been a friend of Wordsworth, but that was it. And all I needed to do to find her writing about walking was Google Harriet Martineau. And there it all was. And the very same thing was with Elizabeth Carter. That connection came about. I was in Los Angeles working on a different project at the Huntington Library in San Marino. And one evening with a bunch of the other women who were there on the same sort of fellowship, I mentioned that I was working on this book. And they said, oh, well, you do know that Elizabeth Carter was really into her walking. And Elizabeth Carter was connected to the project that I was working on at the time. I said, no, I had no idea. So what I did for her was Google Elizabeth Carter, and there are all of her works. So in terms of retrieval, this was not a adventure story of archival rescuing. The material is easily accessible. We're just not looking for it. But I think one of the other factors at play here is that Elizabeth Carter, for instance, doesn't write a big book about, here I am going off into the wilderness. She doesn't write a whole book about walking. What she does is write about her walking in letters to her friends. And they were published after her death, but they don't have the same status as the sorts of works that Leslie Stevens writes, or Robert Macfarlane, or any of the other, big walker figures that we could name, all of whom I think would be male. So they're in these, and I'm going to put my fingers into scare quotes here, lesser forms of works, which means that they don't get taken notice of. I mean, not that that was the case for Harriet Martineau, who wrote a guide to the Lake District in which she talks about all the different walks that she's been doing around the lakes as part of becoming familiar with the landscape. So I think it's a combination of things that means that we don't know that these stories are there, that we've got assumptions about what women could and couldn't do, which means that we don't think there's any value in going and looking for these things. We're looking in the wrong place because we're looking for women to do exactly what men do. And for various cultural and social reasons, they don't necessarily do that. And when they do write about walking, it's not necessarily in the same sorts of ways that men do. Almost none of the women that I cover are interested in climbing mountains. They do other kinds of walking. And that doesn't necessarily map onto our culturally received ideas of what walking is for. So it's all there. And anybody who's interested in the women that I write about could easily just Google and find the materials that I've been working from. It just needed someone to go and look.
Yeah. How easy was it to get this idea and this book published?
Oh, that was a long journey. The book had been in a reasonably finished shape for a little while, and I'd been knocking it backwards and forwards with some friends of mine who I trust to give me good feedback. And I'd made a decision reasonably early that I didn't want it to be an academic book, which gets sent off to a press that does very little promotion, prices the books at £70 or £80 that nobody but libraries can buy them, and then nobody ends up reading it. I didn't want that for this book. I thought the story was too important to get locked away in one of those. But no one I knew had much experience of working with publishers who weren't academic presses. So I tried to get an agent. So I sent the book off to various agencies in London and Scotland and got some nice feedback from some of the people that replied. They loved the book. They just didn't think they could sell it, and other comments of that kind. So not managing to place it, I sent it to the literary consultancy for some review, for which I paid. And that feedback was enormously helpful, not least because it came with some industry help, some tips and pointers for how to place it. But it went backwards and forwards to publishers, to agents for, I think, 3 or 4 years. And it wasn't until I wrote to History Today, who I saw on Twitter, asking for people to pitch articles to them. And I wrote and pitched an article about Sarah Stoddart Hazlitt, to which they said yes. And I wrote that. By this point, I was 9 months pregnant, sent that in. That was published, I think, 2 weeks before I gave birth. And it was a few days after that, and I was still in the hospital with my son at this point, when I got an email from Dave Watkins at Reaction saying he'd really enjoyed the History Today article, saw that I was writing a book about the topic. Would I be looking for a publisher at all? At which point my very tired post-birth body decided to do some very lame jigs ups and downs because I'd struggled so much to get a publisher. And Dave and I entered into a dialogue that was quite sporadic at this point because obviously I was first-time parents. There was a lot going on there. But over the next few months, with his feedback, I knocked up a new draft. It got reshaped. And then a few months after that, he thought it was at a point where he could take it to his board. And at that point, it was accepted for publication. So it's been a really long journey trying to get it placed. But it's found an absolutely wonderful home at Reaction. And Dave's been such a champion for it. And I'm incredibly grateful to him and the whole team for steering it through.
I'm so grateful. Good job, Dave. Thank you for helping to promote women's stories and women's voices, because, the struggle to get the stories out there is very, very real. But you are also involved with Nan Shepard. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about sort of who Nan Shepard is, what you're doing with Nan Shepard's letters.
So there's a pattern at work here. So I'm reasonably bloody minded about women's stories. I get really cross about how they're handled and how little exposure they get. And again, this is something that you see with male writers, that they get these wonderful editions of their whole works, their letters are beautifully edited, and there's this whole magnum opus of everything that they ever wrote, every word, every bit of their juvenilia, everything until they died is beautifully presented and lapped up by readers who then, this is canonical stuff. And that so rarely happens for women. So I was working on my chapter on Nan Shepard. I was up in the National Library of Scotland because I'd read Robert Macfarlane's introduction, and this is where my gratitude to Robert Macfarlane knows no bounds, because he's been an extraordinary champion for Shepard's work. And his introduction, he cites some of the letters at the NLS. And for my research on the chapter, I thought, well, I should absolutely go and have a look at those. So living not far from Edinburgh, that was no difficult thing. So off I go up into special collections. Out comes the deposit box, and there I am reading these amazing letters, most of them to Neil Gunn, a fellow writer in Scotland of novels and poetry, and with whom she discussed the composition and potential publication of The Living Mountain. So a really fascinating set of letters. And I was just sitting there reading these things going, has anyone done anything with these? I mean, beyond what Macfarlane has quoted in his introduction, has anyone done anything with these? And at this point, I should say that one of the things I do as an academic is work as a scholarly editor of women's letters, because, as I say, this is one of the most important things I think that you can do to improve a woman writer's reputation, is give her the same sustained and substantial scholarly treatment that men have received for a very long time. So I'd worked on other projects. I'm working on a long running project on a writer called Hannah More to edit her letters. So I thought, well, has anyone done that for this person? So using my experience of working on Hannah More's letters, I've got a friend who's an extremely gifted archivist and very, very talented at finding difficult to locate items. And I asked him, well, how did you find all the letters that Hannah More wrote? So he told me. So I did the same thing for Nan Shepard and was able to find about 250, I think, surviving letters to and from Nan from various people in different places across the country. And that seemed to me to be about the right amount for a nice single volume that would hopefully shed some new light on her writing, on her career, on her love of the mountains. So that project has been ticking over whilst I finished the book, but I've now recently got a British Academy mid-career fellowship, which gives me a year's teaching relief from my job at university to basically go off and play with these letters and produce them as an edition. And they'll be coming out with Edinburgh University Press in 2023. And COVID-19 willing, hopefully a sequence of public engagement activities, which I'm hoping will involve some talks at various locations in the Cairngorms that mattered to Shepard. I had a plan to do a fringe show on Shepard's letters, but that may or may not come to pass with restrictions on theatres at the moment. But one thing I do hope we'll be able to do is develop walks in the Cairngorms based on Shepard's writing, The Living Mountain in particular, but also things that she says in the letters, that people can do and visit places that mattered to Shepard. So that's something I'm working on at the moment. So it's another project born out of, well, seriously, has no one done this before? And going off into the archives and then finding another rich treasure chest full of amazing things. The letters are absolutely fantastic.
What do you hope people will take away from reading the book Wanderers. I forgot the name of the book. Wanderers.
All of those titles would be absolutely fine. Wandering about wanderers, about wandering. Yeah. What I really hope they take away is something that Kathleen Jamie in her foreword to the book really pointed out. I hadn't quite seen this in what I'd written, so it wasn't until Kathleen Jamie wrote about this. But the idea of a female tradition at our backs, that we are always, as women, walking with other women. And you were talking earlier about the importance of Strayed as a role model for other women who now see themselves as the sorts of people who might do the Pacific Crest Trail. I think that is unspeakably important, that we have visibility for women doing things that, you know, when we look at the mountains, you know, women think, yeah, that's for me. I can do that. I know about this person who did that. That sounds great. You know, Linda Cracknell talks about going up into the mountains and camping there alone and really evangelises for it, you know, the liberation of it. Well, that's a wonderful thing to know about. I could go off and bothy or bivvy. That's absolutely for me. So I think, if nothing else, I would love for women and for men to come away from reading the book knowing that, first, the history of walking, as we understand, is vastly more complicated, interesting, diverse, different to what we've received, and for women to feel like they belong in the hills, on the rivers, in the cities, on foot, wherever it is that they want to go walking.
Oh, absolutely. And Kerri, where's the best place for people to find more information about you, to keep updated with what you're working on, and to get copies of this amazing book, Wanderers, A History of Women Walking?
In terms of keeping up with me, I've got a very badly maintained university webpage. I haven't updated that particularly recently, but I am Googleable. For more sort of up-to-date stuff, I'm on Twitter, and you can find me at Kerri Andrews UK. And I post stuff about the Shepard project there and other things that I'm up to. And there'll probably be some very geeky excitement as the book comes out. Because I've never done this before. I've never written a book that's been read by more than 2 people. So I'm going to be very excited about that. But if you can bear that, that will be happening on Twitter. If you're interested in getting hold of a copy, you can go to Waterstones. They've got it available for pre-order. If you write to or phone your local bookshop, they'll be able to order it in for you. We're hoping to do some signed copies, but that's in development at the moment. And there's always Amazon as well. If all else fails, you can get the book from there.
Fantastic. Dr. Kerri Andrews, thank you so much for coming on and sharing more about your passion for walking and women getting outside and experiencing the outdoors, and just sharing more stories of these incredible role models. It is so important, the work that you are doing, and we will definitely have to do a follow-up interview when your Nan Shepard book comes out in 2023. So I know we'll all be waiting for it.
It's wonderfully kind. Thank you so much for inviting me on. The people who you've had on this podcast before have just blown my mind. So to be even close to their company is an extraordinary privilege. Thank you so much.
Hey tribe, I hope you enjoyed the episode with Dr. Kerri Andrews. I absolutely love what she is doing and the work that she is doing to increase the amount of female role models out there by sharing these incredible stories. So everything that we have talked about today will be available in the show notes at toughgirlchallenges.com. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm the host of the Tough Girl podcast and the founder of Tough Girl Challenges, which is all about motivating and inspiring you, but also increasing the amount of female role models in the media. I just want to give you a suggestion of a podcast episode to listen to, which I think fits really well with what Dr. Kerri Andrews is doing. So previously, we have actually spoken with the awesome and the inspiring Jackie Hill Murphy. Now, Jackie is an explorer, teacher, filmmaker, and speaker, and she spent the past few years exploring and filming some of the most inhospitable and remote places on Earth. And what she does is she's been recreating the journeys of the early women explorers, and she has just done some of the most phenomenal things that you can imagine. So Jackie has recreated the journeys of Isabel Godin, who's the first woman down the Amazon in 1769. This was done by traveling down the river Bobonzaya in Ecuador and onto the river Pastaza in Peru in a dugout canoe, and investigating the real truth behind her story at each landmark. Jackie's also spoken about Mary Kingsley, who climbed Mount Cameroon in Africa in 1894, Isabel Brooks, Isabel Bird, Kate Marsden, who undertook a grueling journey by horse, sledge and cart thousands of miles across Siberia to take relief to the lepers in 1892. So Jackie replicates their journeys as closely as possible via buses, trains and boats. So please do go and take a listen to the episodes with Jackie Hill Murphy. We've actually spoken to Jackie twice, most recently on March 5th, 2020, where she shared more about the expedition to travel the length of the Amazon River and find out more about the Lost Inca Trail expedition. We have spoken to so many incredible women around the world doing amazing physical challenges. And the reason I'm able to share these stories is due to the financial support of patrons. You can sign up as a patron by visiting patreon.com/toughgirlpodcast. You can sign up as a monthly patron or an annual patron. There's also the opportunity to subscribe in US dollars, euros, and sterling. Just want to say a massive thank you to Ventia Dam, who has just signed up as an annual patron, a massive, massive thank you. I really do appreciate it. It is what allows me to continue to produce these episodes. So if you've been inspired by the Tough Girl podcast, if you've been motivated by the Tough Girl podcast, if it has helped to change your life, think about what it could do for other women if they heard these episodes and, started integrating the tips and the tricks and the learnings from these incredible women. Please consider paying it forward. Sign up as a patron. New episodes come out on the Tough Girl podcast every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 a.m. UK time. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. Take care, lots of love, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.